Today on the podcast, we finish our four-part story about the most infamous day in the history of Disneyland. The day when young protesters staged an event in the park, completely taking over Tom Sawyer Island, using the deck and rigging of the pirate ship in Fantasyland as a political pulpit, and then, as we will explore today, overtaking Main Street. This is often called Yippie Day or the Yippie Invasion of Disneyland. For its part, Disneyland management and local law enforcement were unable to effectively interpret messages arranged by the Yippies through alt weeklies, underground radio, handbills, and so on to develop a deeply informed response. And this was part of the Yippies' plan, to confuse those in authority by using methods of communication outside of familiar channels. The culmination of this standoff, as we'll explore today, takes place inside the park. It was also the day when the political realities of America first disrupted and changed the park, a day that was a forerunner to other events in later years. But before we get to all that, I first need to thank another group of new Bandcamp subscribers. We're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast, so these are the people who keep this podcast going. Thanks are going out today to Michael M., Murdoch 643, Nick, Ray the Pixie Bane, Mickey T., Chazwo, Rebecca, H. Gillette, Steve P., Dean R., and Dave Time. I'm deeply grateful for each of the people who have joined us over on Bandcamp as they help this whole enterprise move forward. And now we're spinning back to October 6th, 1970, the final moments of the Yippie Invasion. Here's the show. By the middle of the afternoon, cast members noticed that there was a new energy moving through the crowd, a feeling that was significantly different than that of a typical Disneyland day, a feeling that was even different than the mood that had permeated the park during the morning. There was a sense that guests were continually eyeing each other with concern, a sense that some in the crowd, now that they'd gone on a few rides and perhaps smoked a joint, were looking for an opportunity to create a disturbance. One cast member, Andrea McGann, recalled that on Main Street, quote, "Yippies became increasingly confrontational with security officers, with management, with other guests." Beyond small dust-ups, political organizers, now that they had left Tom Sawyer Island, were directing interested Yippies toward a protest that could be photographed by dozens of reporters in the park and then featured in newspapers across the country. The most successful Yippie protest had used the visual language of a photograph to create a statement. The protest in New York had placed long-haired Yippies against Wall Street, a symbol of America's financial culture. The protest in D.C. had placed long-haired Yippies against the Washington Monument and the Capitol building, symbols of America's government system. And a protest in the park, if staged on Main Street, would place long-haired Yippies against cinematic visions of America's small-town past. From undercover officers moving through the park, Officer Bastrop understood plans now being formed by Yippie leaders that 300 to 400 of them were attempting to organize a demonstration at the front of the park, quote, to raise flags, make speeches, and create problems. Forewarned, we moved a number of police officers around the backstage area behind City Hall, out of sight, but only a few feet away. As the Yippie gathering moved onto Main Street, at least two people recalled that park managers made their first announcement over the PA system, that guests should avoid areas where there was a minor disturbance. Though there had been clear signs that problems existed in the park earlier that day, this was the first time that Disneyland officials acknowledged these problems with guests in the park. One Disneyland manager explained that at about this same time, roughly 25 yippies, more intent on having a good time than creating a political demonstration, formed, quote, a conga line that snaked through the Main Street hub area, chanting, "LSD has a hold on me." From there, real problems began. As one Bay Area yippie recalled, quote, "Right across the town square from City Hall is, do my eyes deceive me, a Bank of America?" For the yippies, Bank of America, who had loaned money so companies could make warplanes and other equipment to support the Vietnam War, was a symbol of the defense industry. From somewhere inside the group, one person yelled, "To the bank!" That same Bay Area attendee explained, quote, "All of us, 500 at most, immediately charged the bank." At roughly the same time, another group gathered around the town square flagpole, where one young man was trying to raise a Yippie New Nation flag with its star and marijuana leaf onto the pole. According to one reporter, quote, "One elderly woman raised her fist in the air and shouted at the group, 'Get out of here and leave our Disneyland alone.'" Another journalist related, quote, "A woman in the area stepped from behind her baby carriage and asked the crowd to stop shouting obscenities while children were present. She was ignored." Some yippies chanted, "Free Mickey Mouse." Others started chants designed to confront corporate America. "Give me an F! Give me a U!" A journalist from the Long Beach Independent reported that, quote, "One long-haired, mustached youth tried to fasten the Yippie banner to a lamppost in front of the park's City Hall. This caused a nose-to-nose encounter with a park visitor. Then a mob of about 300 yippies began to snake dance around the plaza and were ordered to disperse by park officers. At this point, yippies began to pull down red, white, and blue bunting that decorated the lamppost. Again, one youth yelled, "We're going to Bank of America." As tensions escalated, 3 of the most senior executives in the Disney organization were on Main Street: Dick Nunes, Don Tatum, and the 77-year-old co-founder of the company, Roy O. Disney. Nunes said that Roy was there, quote, "When it all broke loose. I'll never forget it. Roy Disney was right in the middle of town square. Don Tatum said, 'Dick, is there anything I can do to help you?' I said, 'Would you please take care of Roy and make sure he doesn't get trampled?'" By now, Nunes and the other Disney executives must have understood their limited options. Their primary goal was to ensure guest safety. This was both a moral and a financial imperative. If a riot broke out in the park, and if Disneyland executives didn't engage police squads before guests were injured, the company would open itself to a host of lawsuits. Beyond this, their goals were to protect the park and to protect its image. One issue here was likely clear now. The police response plan to control the park was disproportionate to the actual problem. 150 riot police waited backstage while, at most, a few hundred rowdy young people paraded and protested on Main Street. The police force would undoubtedly look like an overwhelming demonstration of control in a place that celebrated freedom and play. But at this point, with chaos swooping down around town square, it was too late to alter the response plan with a smaller police force that better matched the problems in the park. As Nunes watched, one of the activists was successful, or partially successful, in raising the Yippie flag on a pole in town square near the American flag. At this point, Disneyland officials crowded in to remove it. Quote, "As this guy was trying to rip down the Yippie flag," David Sachs recalled, "one of the demonstrators said, 'If you rip down our flag, we'll rip down your flag.' He started to try to untie the American flag to bring it down." Following this, as reported in the LA Times, quote, "A fistfight erupted between a long-haired and a tourist." At this point, accounts differ as to exactly what happened next. It's clear there were multiple groups inside the park, various factions united under the broad banner of Yippiedom. Some of those, gathering by the bank, were largely focused on critiquing the war in Vietnam. Others, around the flagpole, wanted to challenge American ideals of conformity and consumerism by altering the consciousness of the country. A few dozen, perhaps more, wanted to soak in the potent energy of a protest or a party without participating directly in any illegal activities. Still others, perhaps the most troublesome, wanted to confront the authoritarian tones of the government and of older Americans with rebellious acts of vandalism and anti-authoritarian violence. To the adults, the differences between these factions were largely invisible, as the young people arranged their appearance in such a way to minimize distinctions. They mostly had long, stringy hair. They mostly wore t-shirts. They mostly wore bell-bottom jeans. Some, despite the heat, wore vests. But inside the Yippie gathering, the distinctions were clear, often with buttons or patches, or even simple social positioning, as each subgroup had its own issues that they wanted to promote. Dick Nunes, who had tried to facilitate an atmosphere in which both the Yippies and the traditional day guest enjoyed the park, had run out of patience. For him, the Yippies were now attacking the culture and traditions of the park, ideals that he associated in part with Walt and by extension with Roy. At least two people recall that Dick Nunes was drawn into a physical confrontation with a Yippie trying to raise the Yippie flag, while one manager remembers that the dispute was actually over a Yippie trying to remove the American flag. Quote, "I watched The Ultimate," one guest explained. "Some Yippie trying to pull down the big American flag in Town Square, and Dick Nunes, head of Disneyland, punched the guy in the face." Nunes himself would later corroborate at least part of this. Quote, "I only got involved, hands-on, when I saw someone trying to pull down the American flag at Town Square. I pulled the man on the flagpole. When he swung at me, I told the cops to book him and insisted that I wanted to be in court when he faced the judge." But what was unclear were the details that led up to this altercation. Tom Nabby explained as the Yippies serpentined around the flagpole, quote, "One of those spat on Roy." In his version, this was the start of the real problems for Dick Nunes. The disrespect showed to the elderly Disney, disrespect that then escalated into the confrontation at the flagpole. Another Disneyland manager, Bill Sullivan, recalled that a later part of this altercation, or perhaps a separate but related incident, took place at the side of the street. Quote, "Dick grabbed one in a headlock and pushed him toward one of the big heavy doors leading off stage. He smashed the guy's head on the door to open it because he was so angry." These incidents with the flag and the Yippies circling Town Square, with some moving toward the bank, convinced Disneyland managers that they were losing control of the situation. Jack Lindquist explained that Dick Nunes arranged a line of employees to prevent Yippies from going back into the park. With security and managers linked by elbows, Nunes called out to the group, "You're going to get out of the park." The line of Disneyland security began to move the Yippies down Main Street toward the exit. Only the Yippies wouldn't go. Instead, they insisted, "We've got a right to be here." Disneyland officials initially used its own security and managers without police involvement to retain control of the park. But the situation now contained tones, perhaps isolated tones, of mob activity. It wasn't a riot, at least not yet. It was a problem isolated to Main Street. But elements of a larger crisis were already percolating up in the crowd. With this, Nunes finally admitted that his security force couldn't manage the growing conflict and allowed police officers to enter guest areas. He also allowed police previously sequestered to the convention center to relocate to the Disneyland parking lot. In doing so, he relinquished control of Disneyland to the Anaheim Police Department. Nunes would later explain how he felt out on Main Street. Quote, "We thought they were going to tear up the park." Ben Harris, Disneyland manager, recalled how the moment played out. Quote, "The captain in charge blew the whistle. At that point, the Hillsbrother Gate opens. Out comes these guys like stormtroopers. Out come the officers at Carefree Corner." Cast member Chuck Shields explained, quote, "Riot police in full uniform entered Main Street. What a sight! All I could think of was that this was a contradiction that Walt could have never envisioned." helmets to boots, the officers were dressed in tactical gear with batons and face shields. Jack Lindquist explained that one kid, maybe 14 years old, yelled at him, "I'm not scared of any fuzz. Bring on the fuzz." The kid's eyes grew large when the police entered the street. Lindquist barked back, "You wanted fuzz? Here it is. I'm going to give you fuzz." In the tour guide office, not far from the flagpole, the cast lead, seeing trouble unfold outside, turned to the other guides. "Everyone, get away from those windows," she said, "right now." Fearing the worst, she locked the door, then told the other girls to lie down flat on the floor and be quiet. Their office was a little more than a kiosk, perhaps 8 feet by 8 feet, encircled on all sides by areas open to guests. One of the guides, lying on the floor, would later say, quote, "Everyone, including me, was scared. There were lots of shouts and a roar of noise coming at us from outside." Though the Yippies were aware of a police presence, some were surprised to see how large it was, something like a military regiment marching down Main Street with nightsticks raised at their sides. One Yippie explained, quote, "All this time we thought Disneyland had a sense of humor. We found out how wrong we were when police in riot gear appeared from every back lot in the park. They'd had enough. There were hundreds of cops, helmets, visors, shields, bulletproof vests, and batons, all new. It was surreal." One employee noted that it was a, quote, "clash between the fists and billy clubs." He also noted that, quote, "many patrons found the fight more interesting than the park's attractions." One Yippie participant would later say, quote, that the police were marching down Main Street toward Fantasyland. The tourists were stampeding in the street. The pigs kept coming. V formation charge in after the Yippies. Another person observed, quote, "Hippies with camping gear ran across the moat of Sleeping Beauty's castle as police with riot gear marched behind them." Somewhere in the confusion, as police moved into the park, a group of typical Disneyland guests gathered on the steps leading to the railroad station to sing "God Bless America," as though these lyrics, by their sheer patriotic energy, might restore a type of middle America order to the park. Out in the park, the police divided what they perceived as traditional Disneyland guests from Yippies, moving each group to a separate side of Main Street. People with long hair and bell-bottoms on one side of the street, people more conservatively dressed on the other. By this point, most everyone was focused on the events playing out on Main Street and knew that their day of rides and shows was now over. Quote, "A second loudspeaker announcement informed guests that Disneyland was closed for the day and that all guests should proceed toward the exits." It was 7:10. Roughly 5 hours before the park was scheduled to close. Aside from the general announcements over loudspeakers, police officers with portable address systems stood in front of groups of Yippies and explained that the gathering had been, quote, "officially declared an unlawful assembly, and anyone who did not disperse would be arrested." The Yippies, who were mostly still arranged into a group, simply stared back at the police. Quote, "So I'm standing there," organizer David Sachs recalled. "My hair's halfway down my back, and they're making these announcements. And so all of a sudden, this policeman comes up to me and says, 'You, get your ass moving,' and just jabs me right in the ribs with his nightstick." Cast member Pat Cannon Todd remembered that supervisors rushed to close up shops on Main Street. Quote, "I was across the street in rings and things. They told us to throw all the money in cash bags and head over to cash control." Police attempted to move everyone out of the park, those with short hair walking down the east side of Main Street, those with long hair, or those who otherwise appeared to be involved with Yippies on the west side. The middle of the street, aside from police, remained empty, giving officers a path to access any part of the street if necessary. Quote, "We walked toward Main Street and saw a line of riot police in front of Sleeping Beauty's castle," park guest Michael Vanchet explained. "It was, to use a term common in that era, mind-blowing." At the front of the park, short-haired guests were released through the east gates over by the kennels. Yippies were released through the west gate on the path that led to the hotel, with directions to either go directly to their car or to directly walk off property. One reporter observed a man who, quote, raised both arms in the air in frustration and said, $400 blown, that's how much it cost me to bring my family out here, and we have to leave in the morning. Though the initial plan was to give guests readmission tickets as they left the park, according to Ben Harris, the crowd was too large to distribute them. It would also slow egress from the park. Guests were simply told to come back any day, explained that they attended on August 6th and they would be let in for free. Quote, over a period of about 20 minutes, security got most of them out, Harris recalled. According to one California paper, quote, the remaining crowd of 29,895 passed through the turnstile exits within 2 hours. But problems continued outside the gate. Yippies pulled up flowers and other ground cover as a type of final demonstration. A few climbed trees, but were pulled down. One guest remembered, quote, seeing young men trying to unfasten a parking lot chain to use as a weapon. Another guest explained that by the time they exited the front gates, quote, it was getting dark. The helicopter was shining its light down on the ground, apparently to spot yippies hiding out. The scene was quite unsettling. A reporter for the Long Beach Independent wrote, quote, one large contingent of yippies led by a bearded youth headed west, chanting, let's go to the Disneyland Hotel. But they were on foot and found nearly a dozen police vehicles waiting for them when they reached the hotel. At 8 p.m., police reported that squad cars were being pelted by rocks. As Officer Bastrop exited the park, he saw a group of yippies, quote, yelling profanities and making obscene gestures at officers. They knew that if any officer started to move toward them, they could run into the moving line of exiting general guests. Then I saw one of the yippies throw a large, fist-sized rock. It struck heavily on the helmet of one officer with such force that the officer's knee buckled. That was it. Lifting my right hand in a gesture to stop the moving crowd, I ran behind the unsuspecting yippies until I reached the one who had just hit the officer. I grabbed him by his long hair with my left hand and the seat of his pants with my right. Together, Officer Bastrop and the yippies went to one of the police buses where the youth was booked, photographed, and fingerprinted, while the crowd in the background softly cheered. It would take, in all, nearly 5 hours to fully clear and check the park. Security needed to sweep each shop, each restaurant, each public space. Quote, I had our supervisors patrol until about midnight to make sure no one climbed our fences that night, explained Dick Nunes. Out in the parking lot, skirmishes between yippies and the police would not end until 11:50 p.m., with the last incident happening at the heliport beside the Disneyland Hotel. One employee, as he was leaving, saw that, quote, flares were being placed around the park's perimeter. Disneyland looked like a bombed-out ruin. In the end, those detained by police faced a variety of charges, including narcotics violations, assault with a deadly weapon, disturbing the peace, trespassing, and failure to disperse. According to the LA Times, those arrested came from, quote, as far away as New York City, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. 3 were charged with felonies. According to the city of Anaheim, the cost for the Anaheim police alone, quote, came to a grand total of $62,930. At the end of the night, once the park was secure, Disneyland management met at Adamo's, an Italian restaurant on Ball Road not far from the park, to talk about how to best handle any problems that might arise the following morning. Dick Nunes said that he would have, quote, a little extra security on hand the next day. For many managers, this was a day that divided the history of Disneyland. There were all those days before the Yippie Invasion when park managers could wholly focus on the ways that guests enjoyed the park. And there would be those days after when park managers also needed to monitor the political climate outside the park and wonder if the political realities of America would again reshape the experience inside of the Disney park. Beyond this, there was also the issue of an appropriate response for such activities. Already, managers sensed that the photographs would ultimately play poorly for the park, depicting an overwhelming police force managing a few hundred unarmed young adults trying to initiate politically focused chaos on Main Street. If there had been strong justification to engage police squads on Main Street, it was this. Though a full-scale riot hadn't exploded in the park, and though Nunes had only observed pockets of disrespectful, violent, disruptive guests, the scene might have moved toward an actual riot, with the mood possibly matriculating from a political gathering to a mob. Maybe this was what it had felt like to be in Santa Barbara a few months earlier, in the moments before the student protests boiled over into a stew of destruction, with a bank building being burned to the ground. Then again, no one attending or working for the park that day would ever know for sure. The following day, after it was all over, Roy Disney sought out Dick Nunes to talk about the incident. "Young man," Roy said, "you know, I'm glad I was here yesterday." "Yes, sir," Nunes replied. "I'm glad it worked out all right. Glad you were here too, so you could see it firsthand." Then Roy, after considering the situation, continued. "The reason I'm glad I was here is because if I hadn't been, I might have thought that maybe you overreacted a little bit, but you didn't." On the day after the Yippie Invasion, Disneyland instituted a new dress code to limit the possibility of another disturbance. Men with long hair could be admitted to the park, but so long as the rest of their appearance was clean cut. According to the LA Times, quote, "Security officers pulled aside long-haired youths at the park entrance and politely quizzed them about why they were at Disneyland, who they were with, their age, and how much they knew about Thursday's confrontation." Security generally admitted young people with long hair so long as they were accompanied by family. After one young man with long hair explained that he was there to meet friends, security warned, "If you have friends in the park with long hair, I wouldn't suggest you go around in a group because security officers are going to bust you right up." The Yippie Invasion represented a unique problem for Disneyland, one for which it was not entirely prepared. It was only the second time that the park had experienced an unplanned closure, the other being the day of national mourning following the death of President Kennedy. The lessons of the invasion for Disneyland managers, hourly employees, and guests were far-reaching. In the Santa Ana Register, editors commended park managers, observing, quote, "The communist organizers of the revolution have made a grave strategic blunder in taking on Disneyland." This editorial was later mimeographed by management and distributed to employees, along with a note of thanks from Dick Nunes. Disneyland manager Van France wrote, quote, "I found it interesting that our world audience thought of Disneyland as their dream and resented the Yippie intrusion. Thousands of letters flowed in from across the country, congratulating us for preserving their Disneyland." One hourly employee, Steve Silverman, viewed the outcome as a failure. Quote, "Disneyland had wanted to see if the two groups in American society, the silent majority and the vocal minority, could have fun together, and it was decided they couldn't." In a press conference, Ken Clements, a spokesperson for the Anaheim Police Department, reminded reporters the, quote, "straight people applauded as officers moved in to break up the crowds." Sherry Chafin, a cast member, said, quote, "The Yippies didn't do any harm that I recall. It was an eye-opener for me, however, and pushed me further into protesting the Vietnam War. Another hourly employee, Andrea McGann, believed that Disneyland security showed great restraint. Quote, if anyone else had pulled stunts like smoking pot and adventure through inner space, climbing up the rigging of the Chicken of the Sea pirate ship, or pulling down the flag on Tom Sawyer Island, they'd have been cooling their heels in the Orange County Jail pronto. For David Sachs, the organizer, the experience was more personal. When asked what he took away from the powwow, he said, quote, the power of imagination in approaching agitprop actions. By agitprop, he likely meant artful propaganda that spoke to the concerns of the people. He also noted that the event was, quote, far more successful in terms of its media reach than we could ever imagine. In that, he was absolutely correct. Photos of the protest, young people standing up against riot police with Main Street in the background, were printed in papers around the world. Following the Yippie Invasion, columnist Dick Gregory pointed out that many of the cultural stories presented at Disneyland were focused on conflict. Sections of Frontierland, for example, present battles between Native Americans and white settlers over both land and ideals, with a cabin aflame and an arrow cut deep into a settler's chest. In his opinion, Disneyland managers were banning a mostly peaceful present-day protest, while they extolled far more violent historical myths elsewhere at the park. He declared the revised Disneyland dress code, quote, a strange blend of age and grooming discrimination. He also noted that Leopold Stokowski, the long-haired conductor and star of Disney's Fantasia, may not have passed the new test on hair length to gain entrance to the park. As time went on, Dick Nunes, in relating his experience, would minimize the conflict and focus on how the park's ideals were restored and preserved. Quote, the wonderful thing, the thing that brought tears to my eyes, that guests spontaneously started singing God Bless America. From Nunes' perspective, it was as though guests were helping to return the park to the schoolboy patriotism embraced by Walt, the simplicity of an earlier time. Quote, it was an unbelievable moment, he said. But as for me, after interviewing cast members who worked at the park and managers who oversaw the park, after interviewing people who attended the Yippie Invasion, after reviewing the historical record, I see it more as a window into America during the Vietnam era. It's clear that the Yippie Invasion included young people with various beliefs. Some of those attending were largely focused on critiquing the war in Vietnam. Another group sought to overcome the long shadow of 1950s conformity through performance, free expression, and experimental drug use. One interesting element of the Disney response was that it acknowledged a plurality of belief in the yippie or hippie culture. Though Disneyland management may not have understood how to navigate youth culture in the 1970s, they at least allowed for complexity in the culture. They needed to prevent another protest from occurring in the park, which for them involved the dress code and visually profiling guests, which spoke to conformist goals that the Yippies were trying to defeat. But it also allowed for flexibility in how these rules were applied, thereby acknowledging that hippie or yippie culture included a multitude of attitudes and beliefs. I also think that the Yippie Invasion provides a unique window into the Disney organization 4 years after Walt's death. During the early 1970s, Walt Disney Productions was largely focused on keeping Walt's dreams alive, with the Disney World project in Florida and with various films that recycled familiar Disney formulas. In part, the company was waiting for leadership to take them in new directions. And in part, the company didn't yet understand how the audience was changing. Walt, during his life, quickly reacted to the way that American appetites changed from the Depression to the war to the post-war boom. In ways, one of the largest problems at Disneyland was that its managers wanted to keep the culture of Walt alive exactly as Walt had defined it for a late 1950s to early 1960s audience. But that audience was no longer there, at least not in the same way it had been during Walt's lifetime. In ways, the Yippie Invasion was a wake-up call for park managers. Even if the park, through a new dress code, could extend the image of the conformist 1950s into the early 1970s, it wouldn't be able to extend the attitudes of the 1950s to the current moment. That era, with its post-war exuberance, was now over. And the park would somehow need to change, adapt itself to this new incarnation of American culture. Exactly how the park would accomplish this is a question that managers would repeatedly try to wrestle down in the years to come. The question that managers, both at the studio and at the park, repeatedly asked was this: what would Walt have done? But the question almost always had a slightly larger context, asking what would Walt have done in the 1950s or the 1960s for an audience that has now changed. This would be one of the central challenges for Disney management to overcome, to separate out some general principles initiated by Walt for his films and parks, and then adapt them to a new era, producing answers that Walt likely would never have imagined. But that challenge would take years, finding elements of Walt's entertainment style that would effectively shape the company's identity as it moved into the future. But in August 1970, in the weeks after the Yippie Invasion, the Disney company was not yet ready to explore those questions in earnest, especially while Roy led the company. Instead, park managers looked out at the ticket booths and on Main Street, some of their innocence having now been lost, as they surveyed the crowd, wary of possible conflicts. The Yippie Invasion had produced a tremendous response in the media, something that activists saw as a success. This, managers understood, could make Disneyland a target for future protests. They would need to watch for this, they knew, as the park moved further from the period overseen by Walt and into those murky years that lay ahead. I'll be back next Sunday with our monthly news and analysis show. And then the week after that, we're going to kick into something special, a series that will not only focus on a key Disney artist, but also focus on how the culture of early Hollywood at Warner Brothers, MGM, and elsewhere changed Disney animation and later the parks. And over on Bandcamp a few days ago, I posted up another chapter in our audio guide to Disney World. We've still got a ways to go to finish up this audio guide, but when it's done, this will be the first full Disney World guide specifically arranged for audio. A guide that will help you explore options and improve your next trip to Disney World. It's designed for audio, for people who enjoy audio, that is, for people like you. Lastly, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We put out a new show every week for listeners around the world to enjoy. But without subscribers, we would simply cease to exist. We do just two things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. If you enjoy these episodes, you can support our efforts by becoming a monthly Bandcamp subscriber. On Bandcamp, you'll find dozens and dozens of extra episodes, but the best reason to subscribe is to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can subscribe at DHI podcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. Until next time, this is Todd James Pierce.